Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jamaica 411. I'm going to cut this introduction very short. And thank you all for joining me. Remember now to please share, like the video, leave your comments in the comment section, as well as to subscribe. And of course, I want to say thank you all for doing so. All right, so this is now my second part of the analysis of some statements that were made by Andre Haughton, Dr. Andre Haughton, who is an economist and the PNP's candidate, I do believe, in St. James. I think it's West Central. He made some comments, so we're going to continue to analyze what it was that he said. So I'm going to ask your indulgence in just listening to what he had to say. And I should give you a hint that he made some reference to a trip that he made to the International Monetary Fund, and he spoke to some gentlemen, and we're going to make some comments on that. But let's listen to what he had said first.
At that time, Michael Manley came into power again, and he came in and inherited a country that was destroyed throughout the 80s by the Jamaica Labour Party. The IMF, having recognized that Jamaica needs this foreign currency desperately, imposed on us what we call the Washington Consensus. So you can go and research the Washington Consensus. It was a 10-point plan aimed at moving Jamaica out of a negative reserve position to put in Jamaica on a positive developmental growth path. Now, contained in the Washington Consensus was a clause to liberalize the foreign exchange market. And when I went to the fund, IMF, in 2017, I spoke to a couple of their lawyers at the time.
And I want to pause here, Mas Andre, and ask the question. You went to the IMF and you spoke to a couple of lawyers who were there at the time. Lawyers, not economists. You spoke to a couple of lawyers. And tell us what it is that they say again.
I spoke to a couple of their lawyers at the time, and they themselves admitted fault to pressure in Jamaica to institute the Washington Consensus without the necessary controls.
So you went to Washington, to the IMF, and you wanted to know the opinion of officials at the IMF as to why it is that they would have gone and pressured Jamaica to liberalize the foreign exchange market without reserves and other controls. And that is what you would have said to them would have caused the problems in the 1990s. And you went to lawyers and spoke to them about it. And the lawyers, you say, are taking responsibility for having pressured Jamaica. I don't get you. What is the profession of a lawyer? What it is that they're there to do? Aren't they supposed to be experts in law? Them are not economists. So their admission don't mean anything. Not at all. You should be bringing to us what the opinion of the staff members, the economists like yourself at the fund would think about what you're saying. But you haven't brought us that. Instead, you're bringing the opinion of some lawyers, and in my view, that's totally irrelevant.
And they themselves admitted fault to pressure in Jamaica to institute the Washington Consensus without the necessary controls.
So according to your version of events, these attorneys, you said, that they themselves admitted fault to pressuring Jamaica to institute the Washington Consensus without the necessary controls. Without the necessary controls. Now, what would be those controls? What is he talking about? Let us investigate, because I believe I found something very interesting and I think I ought to bring it to your attention. Because what Dr. Horton is suggesting, that liberalizing the foreign exchange, you couldn't just do it so. There had to be other things that you must do. You have to do other things first before you liberalize. And he's saying that the IMF was the one that forced the government of PJ Patterson at the time to liberalize the foreign exchange market before the steps were put in place. So what we are going to do now, we are going to investigate to find out, first of all, what were these controls that Haughton talked about that needed to have been in place first before we liberalize And is it true that they were not in place? And that is the reason why we had a collapse of the financial sector. Let us go and investigate. So we went digging, and what we found was an article put out. It says Exchange Control Liberalization in Jamaica. And it was a study for the private sector organization of Jamaica that was done by the London Economics. It's dated March 1991. So this would have been about what, 6 months? March, April, May, June, July, August, September. 6 months before the actual liberalization of the foreign exchange took place, which occurred on September 25, 1991. So what we're going to do is to see what we can get from this report and see if it is of any use in terms of enlightening us as to what it is these people talking about regulation and deregulation, so we can understand them better when they speak. You all agree? Yes. So we're going to start with the executive summary, and not going to read everything, but just to get a background before we get to the meat of the matter. So it says, over the period 1973 to 1988, you recall what occurred in 1973. In October of 1973, we had the first world oil crisis, which was caused when the OPEC countries, those are the Arabs, decided that they now take the cheapness business again with them oil. And I do believe, if I recall right, that they doubled the price of the crude oil, which threw almost every country in the world into a tizzy, those who were not oil producers themselves. And Jamaica got caught up in that. So you can imagine our oil bill and our import bill would have doubled. And then when that filters through the economy, you know what will happen with prices. So Jamaica immediately found itself in a position where it could not afford, well, it didn't have the foreign exchange to pay for this sudden increase in its oil bill. So eventually we had to turn to the IMF for balance of payment support. And therefore, they're saying here, over the period 1973 to 1988, so it spanned the period when the PNP was in power under Michael Manley and when Eddie Seaga was in power. When developing countries as a whole raised their real gross domestic product by over 80%, Jamaica's real gross domestic product fell by 10%. So our economy was in decline. We lost 10% of our production, is what this would be saying. Production, I suppose, in goods and services. Even though it has recovered well since 1985. Against this background, all restrictions on the economy, including Jamaica's exchange controls, deserve close scrutiny. Now that we're doing better, let we look now and see if we need to carry on this restriction on the economy and the foreign exchange control. That is what the PSOJ would have been hiring these folks to look at. The argument for exchange control in Jamaica is that the economy is a small, open, and import dependent. It would be destabilized by the likely accompaniments of liberalization, capital flight, and currency depreciation. So they were predicting that based upon how the private sector behave, that if they were to liberalize the foreign exchange control, people just take the money out, which is what they were doing, why they had the control in the first place. And that would now cause the currency to depreciate because guess what? We still import. We depend on imports. And so they're saying that because we depend on imports and the foreign exchange are run, then now it would cause the Jamaican dollar to depreciate against the US dollar. And that would be very destabilizing. That was one argument for maintaining the exchange rate control. The case against them, which is the exchange control, is that they distort purchasing and investment decisions, naturally, because it's the government who is making the decisions about that. And it goes on to say, and inhibit initiative. And they are talking now about the private sector being limited by what it is they can do because of these regulations. It goes on to say, to the extent that they sustain an overvalued exchange rate, which is exactly what used to happen, they tax any industry which faces foreign competition, provide investors with a one-way bet against their currency, and discourage inward investment. So those are the drawbacks of having this regulated economy and regulated foreign exchange. The key question for the study is not whether controls are damaging. They are, so they accept that. But whether the transition to a deregulated state can be achieved at this juncture, at that point in March, without damaging the economy by more than the benefits. In other words, if we go deregulate, are we going to benefit from it, or are things going to get worse? Which means that whatever benefit there may be, right, the damage would exceed that. So that is what the study is trying to determine. What would be the extent of the damage and whether the benefits outstrip the damage. So now they're saying this study has modeled the way the economy has behaved since 1973 to see how it might be expected to cope with liberalization. So they are looking at how people behave in 1973 onwards, and they want to see now if they were to liberalize, how they would likely behave. And this they are saying that based upon their study, it indicates that the economy has not demonstrated sufficient dynamism to cope very well with liberalization, and gross domestic product would probably fall initially. So them saying we not reach a stage yet where our economy can cope with liberalization, and they fully expect if they were to implement that the gross domestic product would fall initially, right? So we would end up produce less. And why? Because there would be fallouts. That is what this is recognizing, that companies would fail. And very possibly the government's investments into the economy, because it's now deregulated, may well be less. That may have been what they're anticipating. But let us continue. The second point now is that the basic problem is that the exchange rate liberalization would succeed by sending price signals to the economy, but the economy is just not yet sufficiently responsive to prices, right? It's not sufficiently responsive to prices because I imagine you had the regulations, plus you have the high duties, which is keeping the foreign imports out, and there is just not enough competition in the economy. So you put in the exchange liberalization, and all it may succeed in doing is sending prices up when the money starts to depreciate. So they're saying that that is one of the basic problems. The third point now is exports. Exports are not responsive to depreciation, meaning the government had a habit of devaluing the dollar to make the local inputs cheaper so that the exporters would have some breathing room. And he's saying that that has not worked, perhaps because the local people may subsidize that, so they would increase their price. Anyway, so exports are not responsive to depreciation. And even though fixed capital investment would respond positively to liberalization, so that now is where we would do well. The fixed capital investment, what is that? That will be investments done by companies in machinery and building and so on in order to increase their own production. So they are saying that freeing up the foreign exchange would improve on that, meaning that the companies them now not being restricted can run go buy them equipment of foreign and whatever else them need in order to make themselves efficient and more productive, right? So there is where one benefit would come in if they were to leg of the foreign exchange. All right. So they're saying that the exports are not responsive to depreciation. And even though fixed capital investment would respond positively to liberalization, it would not feed through to exports strongly enough, which would suggest that yes, the people are going to be retooling, but it would not increase exports a great deal, which would almost suggest that these persons who would have been retooling are producing for local consumption. You follow? And not export. Because then again, maybe them still can't compete a foreign. So these are the three considerations, right? The economy just does not demonstrate sufficient dynamism to cope with the liberalization. We have a basic problem with the foreign exchange liberalization because then although it would send a positive price signals, the economy is not sufficiently responsive to prices and exports would not be affected, even though local production would more likely be, because the companies would now start to retool with their freeing up. And of course, they went on to say that taking those 3 points in mind, they now have a policy recommendation of the study. And who are they recommending these policies to? The government. Yes. So the London Economics, whoever they conducted the study on behalf of the PSOJ in looking at the idea of deregulating the economy and deregulating the foreign exchange market. And now they are saying to the PSOJ, these are the policy recommendations that we will make based upon where Jamaica was at that time in 1991. So now we're going to turn to see what it is that they recommend the government should do. So first recommendation that they made was to look at the exchange rate liberalization. And since that apparently was the objective, exchange rate liberalization should be approached by accelerating the program of deregulation of the domestic economy, because that is under control too, to allow it to become more responsive. So the first thing they're saying you should do if you want to liberalize the foreign exchange, do not liberalize your foreign exchange first. The first thing you should do is to look to accelerate the program of deregulation. They never say if you do it quickly, Them saying whatever pace you're moving at, now move a little faster, right? And get that done first. Make the economy more responsive, and then now you can talk about you're going to deregulate your exchange rate. That's what they recommend as their first point. Now, the deregulation in the economy was ongoing. It had begun, it says here, in the mid-1980s when the government started the liberalization and deregulation of the economy, and this process continued into the early 1990s, right? And then now it's the foreign exchange that we're focusing on. When are we going to deregulate that? And that was why the PSOJ decided to commission these guys to make recommendations as to when it is best to remove exchange controls. And the process of lifting the exchange controls actually began in 1990 when the government allowed the exporters to have foreign exchange accounts. And then they extended that to other players. But the timing of the full liberalization is what they wanted now to determine. See? Yes. The next recommendation, I'm talking now about competition. If you're going to deregulate the domestic market, the focus that you should have is on competition itself, because that now is what is going to make the exchange rate liberalization work. So they said more competition in the domestic economy. That is what is required, more competition. And remember, in 1991, I believe, we had already introduced the Fair Competition Act, which discouraged these cartels from forming up and continuing to gang together to fix prices and therefore kill any competition in the market. That's what they used to do in those days. And the Fair Competition Act came and mashed that down. So they're saying now that what we need is more competition in the domestic market, right? Good. Next, we need less public ownership. That process of divesting the public owned bodies, companies that the government had, that had actually started under Papa Eddie in the mid 1980s as well. Matter of fact, from the early 80s, I do believe. And it continued and accelerated a great deal when Manley came into office. So that was underway. Then he said, fiscal neutrality. What does that mean? It means that whatever decision government is going to take in terms of its taxes, how it spends, and how it borrows, it must not have a negative effect on the economy. Then they speak now of the removal of price and wage controls. And these elements would make and contribute to the objective, which is to make the domestic economy more competitive. That's what that is saying. And once we achieve the competitiveness in the economy, then the economy now will be more responsive to the exchange rate liberalization. That is my understanding of what it is they're saying. And again, you want this to happen first before you talk about you're going to liberalize your exchange rate. Then they go on to say once the economy has acquired the market reflexes to cope with the exchange control liberalization, trade and capital liberalization should proceed together, preferably on the basis of managed floating. Managed floating has to do with the exchange rate policy, which is to allow it to fluctuate against other currencies, but that the Bank of Jamaica can jump in from time to time to stabilize the currency. Now, in terms of the trade liberalization, that had begun again under Papa Eddie in the 1980s, and that was the reduction of customs duty and tariffs in general. From the very high that it was, they had brought it down. And that is what they're talking about. For the capital liberalization, now they're talking about the movement of money and other assets across the borders. So people can freely send money into Jamaica to invest, and people can freely send money out of Jamaica to invest. And that now is what they're talking about, capital liberalization, and that also included removing the exchange control. Follow? Yes. So that kind of liberalization and trade liberalization now them say should happen together because everything now will be in place. Your economy is competitive and therefore you can now reduce the trade tariffs on imported goods and allow capital to flow across the borders. And then at that point now you can let go the foreign exchange and it will find its footing. At first, you might have a little problem with the GDP, but after that, you will be set. And that is basically what they were saying. The fourth recommendation, they said, the fact that the exchange controls in Jamaica are leaky, meaning that there are controls, but we are Jamaican and we found ways to avoid it and get foreign exchange outside of the official system. So they are saying the fact that the exchange controls in Jamaica are leaky is an argument for abolishing them at the earliest prudent opportunity. So people are saying, look, the thing now works, so just abolish it and done. Meaning, let's do it quick and fast. They went on to say, though, even though that's a prevailing view, incomplete controls, meaning to say, if you don't do what we suggest, get your economy competitive, get rid of some of them public assets, and remove price and wage controls. If you don't do that, this would mean the process is incomplete. So incomplete controls may combine the problems of liberalization with the discouraging effects of controls on inward investment. And remember, inward investment is investments coming from abroad into Jamaica. And if you liberalize the foreign exchange, we know that won't cause a problem. But if you don't follow the process of getting the economy right first, and you go liberalize before that, then you will only succeed in compounding the problem you already have. And what is that problem? that people are not investing in Jamaica because of all of these regulations that were taking place at that time. So they're saying you must unbound and bleach and blind get those things in place first. So these were the 4 recommendations that were made by London Economics team, which was led by Dr. Nicholas Owen, who was a study director at that time. And those were the essential elements that should have been put in place before we liberalize the foreign exchange. These are the elements that Haughton would be speaking about, and he was suggesting that they were not in place. But is that so? Let us check and see. Now, the PSOJ would have spent good money to get this guide as to how they should approach the matter of this liberalization of the foreign exchange, what recommendations that they should make to the government, and they need to understand the problem first. And in March of 1991, they had this report given to them. So, what happened? Was it that the PSOJ went to the government and said to PJ, we have this recommendation that we had commissioned, and they said that this is what we need to do before we liberalize, and we really need a liberalization. But them said we should get the economy, competitive first, and so on. And we think you should take that view. Did that happen? Did they go to PG and tell PG about this? Because R. Danny Williams, in his submission to the FinSAC inquiry, said that he had led a delegation, he and some other private sector interests had met with PJ, and they said to PJ that they believe any deregulation of the economy as well as the liberalization of the foreign exchange should not be done in any phase. They should do it quickly. And I wonder if at the time when R. Danny Williams went to PJ and met with him, did he know about this particular report? Did the government know about the report? Did the PSOJ share that report? Because at the end of the day, what PJ went and did was to liberalize the foreign exchange in September 25, 1991. The question is, and I'm talking to Andre Horton now. Andre, pay attention. The question is, when PJ took that decision to remove the final controls on exchange, September 25 of 1991, was the economy in a competitive state? Was the economy in a competitive state? So this is what we now need to determine. When it came to the price controls and the control on wages, as you can see, that process started in 1989. The wage guidelines to the private sector, that was abolished in March 1991, which was before the liberalization of the foreign exchange. So, and of course, it says here that the early 1990s price controls for basic commodities were removed as part of the broader economic liberalization effort. So the Michael Manley-led government had already dealt with this matter of the price and wage control. So they had begun that process. Matter of fact, it appears as though it was complete. To make the economy more competitive, they had already removed price control and wage control. They were making every effort to sell those public assets. And what else was left for them to do? According to what the recommendation was, that they should now begin the process of the trade and capital liberalization at the same time. And that process began in 1991. So there is the appearance that almost everything was in place at the time. But let us do a check-off just to make sure. So first of all, it says the exchange rate liberalization should be approached by accelerating the program of deregulation, and that had already started in the 80s, and it had continued and was completed in 1991. So we're going to tick that one off. Next, we needed to make the economy more competitive. the domestic economy, and we needed to get the government out of the economy. So they were suggesting that we get rid of those publicly owned companies such as JPS and Cable and Wireless, telephone company as it was, JBC, all of those companies. The government needed to have divested itself of them, and there were several companies were up for sale, but it took a while to get rid of some of them. So we're going to call that completion as well. And then finally, they talk about the removal of price and wage controls, and that was completed in March of 1991 before deregulation. So you see, they knew what needed to have been done and they were doing it, preparing the country for the ultimate removal of foreign exchange controls. Next now, let's see if the third one was also accomplished. Once the economy has acquired the market reflexes to cope with exchange control liberalization, then now trade and capital liberalization should proceed together, and they had already completed the process of the liberalization of the capital market in 1991 when they discontinued the credit ceilings and selective credit restrictions. Those were discontinued. Then they said they had ceilings on savings deposit rate along with other restrictions on consumer credit. That was lifted. And at the same time, however, the financial intermediation was being restricted with the rise in the liquid asset ratio of commercial banks. That was the only one they kept in place. And that was the one that they used to regulate the credit that was available during the high interest rate regime. So these were the elements of control that need to have been lifted, abolished, removed out of the way to create an competitive environment in the economy before we implement the liberalization of the foreign exchange, as you can see from what we read. They were more or less in place. The government continuation of its selling of the assets, that was ongoing. And there were a whole heap of government entities that needed divestment. And up to this day, we still have a whole heap more that needs divesting, right? So when Haughton said that we weren't prepared, and when people are telling you and me that the liberalization of the foreign exchange was premature, what are they talking about? Horton mentioned controls in place, but there was no recommendation that the government need to put any control in place. What control? They were talking about taking the controls off and allow the free market of demand and supply to determine prices. The final item was a trade liberalization, which would have been implemented by reducing all those tariffs, those very high tariffs. They would have brought them down, which would now allow competition in the economy coming from outside. And that was also implemented. And I do believe the reduction in the tariffs would have been the last thing that the government would have done. And that they did in phases, all the way through until December 1997, when the last sector, the insurance sector, was liberalized. Now, Mas Andre, I want you to tell me if you would agree that the government was aware of what was needed to be done prior to the introduction of foreign exchange liberalization. Would you agree with that? And would you agree that they had been carrying out faithfully the process of preparing the economy for that day? And would you also agree that in September 25, 1991, they would have been advised, perhaps by the Bank of Jamaica, that all was in place, with the exception of those ongoing processes like the selling of the government assets and the trade liberalization, which took a little more time, right? Those were phased in. The economy was more or less ready. The price control was removed. The wage controls were removed. And for the capital market, all those impediments were lifted, right? Competition now was in the market, and therefore they were ready to implement. And yet, when in September 1991, when they all believed, I am sure, that everything was in place, they then decided to lift the exchange controls, and then it all went haywire. The question is, why? Why did the Jamaican dollar depreciate so rapidly? 108% in what, 5 months? I put it to you, Andre, that it was the increase in the money supply that was the real cause of that issue. I want you to recall that in 1991, the very same year when we lifted the foreign exchange controls, it was in that year that the money supply had increased by 97%. That is almost the doubling of the money supply. And here it says an increase in the country's money supply generally leads to a depreciation in its currency in the long run. The money supply increased. We had no reserves to back up the currency. And then we lifted the foreign exchange controls. As an economist, Andre, would you agree that the most likely culprit for the rapid devaluation in the foreign exchange that occurred at that time was not the liberalization in itself, but in fact the doubling or the almost doubling of the money supply at that time? It would have caused inflation to have been going on, and then there would have been speculation because people who have experience of what happened in the 70s and 80s when the currency started to devalue would start to buy up foreign exchange in order to preserve their purchasing power. And that now would put further pressure on the exchange rate. Wouldn't you agree that that is the most likely culprit? And that rapid increase in the money supply would have had nothing to do with the Washington Consensus. That was PJ as Minister of Finance creating money illusion. That would have been our doing. And that was not the doing either of Eddie Siaga. I am sure he was increasing the money supply in those days too, because you had a lot of inflation that was coming through the system. And then this went and compounded it. And then we let go the foreign exchange and bam, pure problem after that. And it was in the attempt to try and stem the rapid depreciation of the currency, plus the hyperinflation was taking place, that this high interest rate regime took place. Now, I am not going to fully blame Omar for that. I put the blame on the people who were taking the loans, right? They were the ones who were causing it. In other societies, when the interest rate increased by 0.25%, them stop borrow and then stop spend. In Jamaica, we probably was a little too smart for our own good. Instead of stop spending and stop borrowing and turn to equity for those businesses that had shares, right? Sell them shares and raise money that way. They never do that. So they continue borrowing. And the reason why they continue borrowing, even when the money was at 60%, because them started to look at it on a monthly basis. Okay, well, 60% means that it will cost me 5% per month in interest rate. I can work with that. And then they couldn't. And it was a comrade who was telling me of his experience where he did that. That reminded me that that's exactly what it was that the people were doing at that time. So no matter how the government raised the interest rate, these damn people are still borrowing. And therefore, there is nobody that they have to blame for their demise but themselves. They are the cause of their own demise. So no matter which way you look at it, Andre, PJ was the one who was the Minister of Finance. It was he who had increased the money supply by 97%, nearly doubling it, that caused the hyperinflation that was taking place. And then it's the same government, led by PJ, that had to try and fix the problem that he created. And it was the interest rate that was available to them, and that was what they used. And then our crazy people now, too smart for their own good, refused to stop the borrowing and end up in the mess that they were in. Their companies began to fail, and the banks went down with them. And there were other things that were happening at the time that caused some of those financial institutions to fail, including what Omar would tell you was a lot of mismanagement in the financial sector. They were taking short-term money and putting it in long-term investments. And then when the people came for the money, they never had to give them. In addition to that, the assets that they were holding were overvalued. A directive had come down that they must start to value the properties at market price. What they were doing evidently was just marking up the price every year. So if they said the property last year was 10 million, this year they say it's 10.2 million without any valuation. And when that was done and they started to value the assets at market price, the whole of them now find themselves into trouble because there was an asset mismatch. You can ask Omar, he will explain it to you. And that was what Omar was referring to as the mismanagement of them affairs. And I do believe that Century and Eagle may have fallen into that bracket. Yes. So you see, however you want to term it, the bullying of PJ by the Washington Consensus to free up the foreign exchange. In terms of the competitiveness of the economy, we were almost there. It was only the manufacturers who were not ready. And this is where I personally said that PJ was at fault, because when those special interest persons led by R. Danny Williams went to him and advised him or recommended to him that he should free up the economy, he should deregulate the economy rapidly, not wait. There were no manufacturers there because they would have said, no, Prime Minister, we're not ready. And then he would have given them the time to be ready. They were the only ones that weren't ready, and they collapsed when the trade liberalization took place and there was a lowering of the tariffs, which now meant that goods from abroad can come in and compete with them. They were not ready, and so they were the first ones to collapse. So in conclusion, had PJ not increased the money supply by 97% in 1991, we may not have had the hyperinflation that took place after, and then people started to speculate on the dollar because they're trying to preserve the value of the money them hold, right? So they started to buy up foreign exchange, and since them could now have bank accounts in foreign exchange, they would probably put on the money one side, waiting until the inflation crisis was over. So again, it was PJ as Minister of Finance who had done that. That was not the Washington Consensus bullying him and forcing him to do that. And that was not the Labour Party that done that either. That was squarely on the shoulders of PJ Patterson. Please come and explain to the people of Jamaica what effect increasing the money supply by 97% in 1 year would have on, first of all, inflation and the value of the Jamaican dollar. As an economist, would you not expect that there would have been a rapid depreciation in the value of the currency in those circumstances? And we all wait to hear your response. Yes. Anyway, folks, let me leave it here for today. Thank you so much for joining me, for sharing, liking, and subscribing, and leaving your comments in the comments section. Until next time, take very good care of yourselves and walk good.
Which means that if you owe somebody $6 today, and tomorrow you owe them $24, 6 fours, 24. It means that the exchange rate moving from $6 to 1 to $25 to 1 saw every person's debt in foreign currency increase fourfold. So the major banks who borrowed in foreign currency, Eagle Bank, Central National Bank, Citizens Bank, these banks that borrowed heavily in foreign currency, found themselves, instead of having a debt of $6, now has a debt of $25, 4 times more. And that means the entire banking system was going to crash.